Hello, Denton once again with another Believe It or Not, in which I present the facts and you, well, believe it or not, as the case may be. So, today's question: is the Bible the book in the sense that it is the direct word of God? Or is it just a book in the sense that, well, it has pages with lots of words on them all bound together, and thus it is definitely a book? Well, there is no question. There is no question that it is a book. As I said, it has pages with words on them bound together, which is the definition of a book. But there is a very, very considerable question over whether or not it is the Word of God. God would be, by definition, infallible, right? I mean, obviously he would be. He couldn't be anything else. Certainly in regards to anything connected with his own creation of the universe and the various events that led from that. Having done it all himself, he would know everything about it. But the problem with the Bible is that those who wrote it, supposedly inspired by God to do so, knew absolutely nothing about how anything was created. They got just about every detail completely wrong. Nor did they even manage to get the subsequent history of the world of their day right either, producing a book that it is a catalogue of error from start to finish. It fails in science, in history, in archaeology, in biology, and just plain common sense. And as to logic, well, the authors of the Bible had no acquaintance with that concept. You will not find logic in the Bible. So I thought I'd have a detailed look at the Bible, a sort of, page by page look. In the words from Alice in Wonderland, start at the beginning, go on to the end, and then stop. Well, Genesis is the beginning, covering, as it does, rather laughably, creation, which makes it an appropriate starting point. Genesis. Yes, as far as being wrong goes, there is hardly anything wronger, for want of a better word, than Genesis. It is so full of holes it makes a Swiss cheese look like a solid body, managing to be wrong on so many levels. That's quite an achievement. Science, astronomy, history, archaeology, biology, it gets them all wrong. Genesis says God created everything: the universe, the earth, the stars, the sun, the moon, everything that exists anywhere. And he did it in 6 days. And we are told by creationists that this occurred only 6,000 years ago. God poofed it all into existence, saw that it was all good, and he took a rest on day 7. Now, what he was doing before day 1, sitting or floating around in the darkness of the void, they don't mention, nor what he did on day 8, since as he'd just done everything it would ever be possible to do, what would he do with his time? He couldn't really do an encore. Now, given that the universe was actually, and provably, created some 14 billion years ago by the Big Bang, and our solar system started to come into, again, provable existence about 4.5 billion years ago, God clearly had nothing whatever to do with it. Unless, of course, you see the Big Bang itself as God's handiwork, which, if you want to look at it that way, would, of course, make everything his creation. Anyway, he created the earth, we are told, by Genesis, and he put a dome over it, the firmament, with water above it. Yes, water. Water above the firmament. So the dome must have been solid in order to hold the water up there, and of course, obviously, that's not true. He made light to begin with, then later on he created the sun, so he did the light thing twice. And later on, he does a few more things twice as well. Genesis says that all animals and plants were created at the same time. Now, obviously, that's not true. Things evolved out of the water over millions of years. They became great reptiles who ruled the world for more millions of years. Mammals came along after that, and they had the world for millions of years, and then the human race arrived on the scene. The fossil record alone shows us original species, transitional versions of those species, and then the more evolved versions of the same species, all of which takes rather more than a single day. Plants were growing in Genesis before the sun was created. Now, obviously, that's not true due to, little technicalities like, photosynthesis, all that stuff. And we are told that the sun and moon came into being together. Well, obviously not true, since the sun was the first thing to exist before the rest of our solar system, including the Earth and the moon. Then things get really interesting. Because, first, God creates all living creatures. The beasts of the earth, every winged fowl, everything that creepeth upon the earth, every moving creature in the waters. And then, in Genesis 1:27, he creates two people, an unnamed male and female. And he tells them to lord it over everything else. And certainly the human race has lived up to that one over the years. But here we had a problem, because a few pages later, in Genesis 2:7, God creates a man all over again. Now, not a second man to go with the first one. Oh no. This is the first man. Again, created from a handful of dust. So, what happened to the first man? Now, dust man is the first man. We already had first man and first female. But now God creates first man a second time, no female nor any intention of creating one this time, and the other two, apparently they just vanish somewhere, they poof off. God then creates a garden, a lovely garden for the dust man, and he puts him in it, telling him to tend it and keep it, and he fills it with trees and plants with all sorts of lovely things on them for the second first man to eat, but with a warning. There's a tree of knowledge of good and evil in the garden, and he must not eat the fruit from it. Why? For some reason, God has just created evil, which didn't exist prior to him sticking that fruit tree into the garden, and a means of accessing that evil by simply eating the very tempting-looking fruit. And he leaves it there where anybody, once anybody exists, can get to it. And thus he himself brings evil into being and provides a handy link to it. He doesn't even put a fence around it with danger, keep out signs on it, or make the fruit so ugly and unattractive looking that nobody's going to eat it anyway. Oh well. Then God decides that Adam, who suddenly gets a name, needs a helper, an assistant to help him with all his gardening duties. So God does it again. He does his double creation thing, creating all the creatures he's already created in Genesis 1 a second time. The beasts of the field, the fowl of the air, everything that creepeth, and so forth and so forth. Again, brought out of the ground for Adam. Where did all the existing, foul, beast, creepy things go? Anyway, Adam gets to name all these things, which, considering the many thousands of various species of everything, was quite a daunting task in itself. But he manages to do it. And after all that, none of them were really a suitable helper for Adam. Now there's a problem. None of these creatures that were made for him to help him, none of them actually are a suitable helper. But God was up to the task. Well, I mean, he would be, wouldn't he? After all, he's God. And what better helper for a human than another human? That makes perfect sense. But instead of grabbing another handful of dust to make another human, he pulls a rib out of the existing one, and with it he creates a female. Another one. He's already created a female in Genesis 1:27. So here we go again, creating things that have already been created. Now, unless all this is actually just a flashback, like in some Hollywood movie, and this is the first male-female thing being retold, which is not the way it reads. The first two were created at the same time, not one after the other. And even if this is a retelling of the first human creation, it makes it quite clear that the man came first. Adam was never intended to have a companion helper. That's why the animals were brought along, to see which one of them could be his helper. He was a one-off project, the one and only human ever intended to exist. That was it, creation over and done with. And the female was only created after all the various creatures of the earth proved unsuitable as a helper for him. There was never any intention for her to exist up to then. But this brings up an interesting question. Sex. Yes, sex would rear its head eventually. Adam was created perfectly formed, and we must assume sexually equipped accordingly, which, apart from being, rather dodgy with that evil fruit tree thing being there, raises the question of gender. Why was Adam a man? A man with the sex organs required to be one, which, since he later fathers children, we must assume he had, when he was the only one there. There was no one else but him, nor was there any intention on the part of God for there to be anyone else. Adam was a one-off, unique creation, put to work tending the Garden of Eden. That was it. He was the one and only human being created, or ever intended to be created. So why does he have the equipment required for reproduction, since he has no other creature like himself to reproduce with? I mean, was it there for him simply to, play with, shall we say? Was it some sort of little toy he'd been given? But none of the animals really make much of a helper, as I've said, for Adam, so eventually God decides to make another human, yanks a rib out of Adam, and Eve is created. Well, a woman is created. This is the Bible, after all, and women are not generally important enough to even get a name, so she is just a woman. So, now we have Adam, able to use the sex organs for reproduction that he was given, despite there being no intention of him actually being able to do so when he got them in the first place, which seems rather unnecessary forward planning, since to begin with, there was no forward plan. And he doesn't know what sex is or what his bits actually do, so even though he now has someone to use them with, he can't use them anyway because, he doesn't know what they're for, and neither does the woman. But there's that tree, and it does. And having had a chat with a talking snake, which, nobody seems to find a bit odd. Personally, if a snake dropped down out of a tree into my face, I'd take a step back, and if it struck up a conversation with me, I'd suffer a bit of incontinence, to put it mildly. But since the talking snake doesn't strike Adam and his anonymous female as anything unusual, they take its advice, eat the fruit, and they discover what their respective sexy bits actually do. And oh look, we're naked. Quick, get some leaves and make some nice little aprons to cover all the dangly bits. Why? I really don't know. They're the only ones there, apart from the snake, so who's going to see them? And the snake, I'm sure, doesn't care. But Adam and his anonymous woman are punished by God for eating the fruit of the tree that God himself put there, something they couldn't have done if he'd simply not created it in the first place, and then he blames them for bringing evil, sex, cruelty, lust, etc., into the world when he himself had actually created it with his stupid and totally unnecessary tree, which he left there without even putting a fence around it. God has a very limited understanding of simple logic. So, Adam and Eve are chucked out of the garden. Get beheads. But at last she gets a name. Adam calling her Eve. And shortly after, Cain and Abel are the result of the world's first hanky-panky. Both of them male, which does seem to be a bit of a bummer if, any more humans are required, but we shall come to that. Anyway, Cain kills Abel, which is really God's fault, since Cain wouldn't have had those desires and emotions if it hadn't been for that tree thing, but he's cast out for doing it. But he's worried. He's worried that someone may kill him. Okay, that's a justifiable concern, but who exactly is likely to do that? He's the only one there, apart from his parents. There is no one else on the planet. So who is going to kill him? But God steps in to reassure him, putting a mark on him that says, "This man is not to be killed. By order of me, God." Excellent. Cain is now protected from all the people who don't exist yet, so he can wander around in perfect safety with his mark that nobody can actually see, since there is nobody to see it unless Cain himself looks in a mirror. But then we turn a few pages, and Cain is making love to his wife. Oh, how romantic. Hang on a minute. hang on, wait a minute. Adam and Eve are the only breeding pair on the planet. So where did this unnamed woman come from? Now, women are so unimportant in the Bible, hardly ever, being even given a name, that could she actually be Cain's sister, who nobody bothered to mention because until she got a man, she just wasn't important enough to be noticed? But wherever she came from, she's there, and Cain knows her, in the biblical sense. And they have 2 sons. And those sons, somehow or other, get wives. Now, let's just think about this logically. Now, I'm sorry, I'm bringing logic into the Bible. Not good, but anyway, think about this logically. There are now only 2 breeding pairs on the planet, Cain and Mrs. Cain, whoever she is, and Adam and Eve, right? Nobody on earth has as yet given birth to a daughter. So where are all these women coming from? Is God off somewhere just poofing them into existence like he did the universe? Because, they can't have come out of a womb, since all the wombs we know about at this stage have only produced boys. I must admit, I'm baffled by that one. Didn't the writers of Genesis realize that they hadn't written about any daughters, which might have been a good idea perhaps before they started, getting wives for people? Then we get the first of the seemingly never-ending genealogies that Genesis loves so much, telling us who begat who and how long they all lived. Impressively long lifespans, of course. People living 800 or 900 years, which obviously, one cannot actually do. And that goes on for page after page after page, with no mention, of course, of the women who are required for all the begetting. And nobody ever seems to beget any girls. It's just a catalogue of begotten boys. So where the girls required to co-beget all these boys are actually coming from, we have no idea. But the plot thickens. Evil rears its ugly head once more. Thanks, of course, to God himself and that fruit tree thing he created. And the earth is now filled with violence. All flesh had corrupted, and the world had been totally corrupted. The beautiful world he created was now filled with evil. But the fact that he is actually responsible for all the evil and wickedness in the world that's upsetting him so much has no bearing on his reaction to it, and he blames the people for it, not himself for creating it in the first place. And he decides to destroy all those evil people, wipe away the corrupted flesh. But for some inexplicable reason, he also decides to destroy all the beasts, all the creeping things, all the fowl in the air, etc., though exactly what they have done to deserve it isn't stated, nor does it make a lick of sense. But God's justice seems more related to whatever little hissy fit he's having at the time than to anything to do with something that anyone, or in this case anything, has actually done. So God will destroy the world. He will wipe it out of existence. He will get rid of this iniquitous sea of filth and evil that has corrupted his wonderful creation. But there is one man who it seems is not corrupted. He is a shining example of what God wanted everyone on earth to be. And that fine man walks with God through the den of iniquity that the world has become. His name is Noah. Mind you, a bit later on we find Noah drunk out of his mind, lying incoherent and totally naked, which might possibly seem to call God's judgment of his character a teeny bit into question. Certainly Noah wouldn't strike me as a shining example of a family man, unless, of course, everyone else, including all the animals, are so hopelessly depraved and immoral and evil that he is just good by comparison. God decides to flood the world. Drown everybody and everything, human and animal, because clearly everyone, save for drunk out of his mind naked Noah, is evil. Every man, every woman, every child, even unborn babies still in the womb are evil. Those babies are just waiting there in the womb, waiting to be born so they can join in with all the depravity. Yes, babies do that. Unborn babies are evil and dangerous, and they must be destroyed before they can add their evilness to the vile depravity of the world. But God will spare Noah, and he'll hold off the flood waters for a bit, so Noah can build rather a large boat, and thus save himself, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. How strange that out of everyone on earth. Only those 8 people are not corrupted. Talk about keeping it in the family. Now he tells Noah to build a giant boat from gopher wood, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, which works out at some 500 feet in length, 85 feet wide, and 51 feet in height, with 3 decks, a window 1 cubit in size on one side, and a door. And it will have lots of rooms in it, and it will be sealed inside and out with pitch. Okay, so 8 people, using the primitive hand tools available in the Bronze Age, and having no knowledge of shipbuilding, are going to construct a ship which is more than half the length and just under the width of the Titanic. There's no mention of anyone else helping them, it's just them, a 600-year-old man, his wife, his 3 sons, and their wives. How long it took them to build their giant boat isn't mentioned, but obviously such a task undertaken by just 4 men and 4 women with no knowledge of how to do it, how to calculate the weight of the vessel and its intended cargo to get the correct buoyancy for the ship, or any other knowledge required to build a ship that won't sink the moment it hits the water. Without any of that, it would take them a great many years. Just felling, cutting, bringing, and finishing all the wood required would be a monumental task for those people, let alone putting it all together. Oh, and by the way, just for the record, they were building a ship, not a boat. If it's small, it's a boat. If it's big, it's a ship. The ark was a ship. And a ship far beyond the abilities of the ancient world to build, or the later Middle Ages, or even today, since apart from its size, it was made of wood. And simply put, a ship that size constructed of wood was, and still is, impossible. At least if you want it not to sink. Wood gives, it bends, it warps. And in a huge ship like the Ark, that would either make it unmanageable due to leakage, or eventually sink it. There is a limit, you see, to the size of a usable wooden ship. The largest ship ever built of wood, a schooner named the Wyoming, built by a professional shipyard, mind you, in 1909, was considerably smaller than the Ark, shorter by some 200 feet, in fact. But due to her size, the motion of the waves caused her hull to warp. The crew spent most of their time bailing out water, and eventually she sank. And yet the Ark, built by a handful of primitive people who didn't know the pointy end of a ship from the roundy end, is going to sail quite happily while laden down with animals and cargo. Not going to happen. The Ark would have had all the seaworthiness of a leaky brick. But to return to the firm of Noah and family, biblical shipbuilders. 2 of every creature are to be loaded aboard the Ark. Everything that walks on the land, creeps on the ground, or flies in the air. The stuff in the water, that can look after itself. A male and female of each kind get tickets for the maiden voyage of the Ark, which would actually, had it occurred, been rather similar to the maiden voyage of the Titanic. The end result would have been much the same. Plus, various numbers of certain other animals that will be used for food are loaded aboard. But there's a problem. How did the polar bears get on board? Or kangaroos, wallabies, penguins, llamas, alpacas, animals that lived thousands of miles away, often across oceans. Did 2 polar bears swim across the North Atlantic, go through the Mediterranean to reach Mesopotamia in time to catch the ship? Or kangaroos and koalas swim across the Pacific and go around Africa to do the same? And a pair of llamas perhaps paddled across the South Atlantic on a raft? And how did they know about it in the first place? Those animals still exist. Therefore, they survived the flood. But they could only have survived the flood by being on the Ark, right? But how did they get to the Ark? Noah's sons hardly traveled around the world collecting them. After all, they didn't have the big ship yet. The writers of Genesis, of course, had no knowledge of animals that didn't live in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Palestine. Animals that couldn't have reached the Ark. Yet they survived the flood, which in itself disproves the whole thing. Unless, of course, you want to have another creation post-flood. Or all those animals actually lived in the Middle East back then, and they only went to Australia, the Arctic, and so on afterwards. Yes, I'm sure a polar bear with its fur coat would have been really right at home in lovely, hot Mesopotamia. Of course, in that case, the same thing does apply in reverse. How did they get there? So the Ark is completed, after decades, one must presume. All the animals, provisions, and the 8 people are loaded aboard, and God sends the waters to cover the earth. He opens the firmament, and it rains for 40 days and 40 nights, which, come to think of it, is actually still only 40 days, since a day is 24 hours comprising both day and night. But well, who's counting? But it's going to be more than a year before anybody can get off the ship. The flood has to recede. Noah has to wait for the land to dry out. And he sends out doves and things to see if the water was still there. Why he didn't just look out of the window, I don't know, but he didn't. But it seems a bit unlikely that any foodstuffs that they had on board for themselves and all those animals would still be fresh for that time, if they hadn't eaten it all, of course. And would they still have had fresh water, on a ship with no refrigeration capability and no way of obtaining any fresh supplies or of growing anything? For centuries, ships had to regularly put into harbour or go ashore on islands they might pass to re-provision, obtain fresh water, and so on. And those ships were not full of animals of all kinds, many requiring considerable quantities of food, various kinds of plants and grain for the herbivores, meat for the carnivores. And even if some of the meat was salted, which animals are probably then not going to eat, you can't salt plants to preserve them, nor can you preserve water in that way. Add to that the issue of ventilation. There's only one little window, for 3 decks on a very big ship, a ship full of animals, and thus also full of animal poo. So Noah's sons must have spent all their time running up and down with buckets dumping things overboard. And the build-up of deadly gases below decks, methane, hydrogen sulfide, and nitrous oxide, would have been considerable. A serious health hazard to anyone inhaling it, and also an explosive atmosphere in a confined space if you're wandering around with lanterns. Animals plus confined, unventilated space over long periods equals methane and hydrogen sulfide, plus a naked flame equals a very big bang. Look what methane could do in a poorly ventilated mine years ago. Fire damp, as they called it. Miners taking canaries down the mine in little cages since they were highly susceptible to the gases. And if the birds fell over belly up, then, everyone got out of the mine very fast. If the oversized, impossible wooden ark hadn't simply come apart in heavy seas, it would have exploded the first time somebody went below decks with their little oil lamp or lantern. So there we leave Noah on his impossibly big ship with his impossible crew and passengers sitting up on Mount Ararat, sending out doves to see if the water was still there rather than just looking out the window. Watch this space for further gripping installments of creation as it didn't happen.